So one thing I forgot, I should do this every single time, of course, is to remind you guys of the outline, which is, of course, on canvas, and it's always a good idea to print that out as you're watching these to kind of get a sense of where we are as we're moving through the material, of course. And also, well, I'm not going to say it now because you don't have it yet, but every time if you do have your study sheet, of course, available, then you should have that ready, so you can be paying attention to what things are going to be identifications. As I begin the second little part here, I want to do a shout out to all my buds there in History 101 on Tuesday, Thursday. So Hadi Rosa, Bernabe, Harrison, Sakali, Dana, Ava, Joe, Dakota, Giselle, Seth, Elixis, Alyssa, Sophie, Blake, Noelle, Moises, Rourke, Anna, Greg, Shunshun, Joshua, Anthony, Tiana, Bianca, Calvin, Kathleen, Brianna, Nicole, Thomas, Matthew, Diego, Valeria, Raul, Angela, Kelsey, Cecilia, Savannah, Samantha, Dustin, McKenna, Manuel, David, Jose, Chelsea, Dylan, Gavin, and Lizzie. I hope you guys are all doing really well. You guys are my biggest class. I have most people in that, so really hoping you guys will be able to hang in there with me. Okay, so where did I put my thing? I was telling you that there's kind of two sides to the story of the Confederation government. It's really weak. Remember, weak by design, of course. That's what the people wanted. But it did do some things. It had some successes. Let's put it that way. I'm going to call these strengths. Okay. Now, some of the strengths are kind of questionable in their nature. So one thing that we often call a strength was the fact that they did create the nation, of course. The Confederation did that. They conducted the Revolutionary War. They won that war, and of course, it's not so much that they actually won it, but the war was won by various activities, including the problems the British had and the fact that the Americans were able to sustain themselves over a long period of time, routinely without significant support of the government itself. They made the peace, of course, so that meant that Franklin and Adams represented the Congress basically when they were doing their stuff in terms of the Treaty of Paris. Now, in reality, that treaty was shaped pretty much by what the British needed to do, of course, especially with their desire to do some damage to the French. So, you can at least say that this was the Congress, this was the government that won the war, that made the peace, of course, the established United States of America, even though really tremendously weak government, unable to really affect too much at all, okay? So, whatever their strengths were, those things that happened, those are important, but really they happen often, as an exception to whatever Congress is doing rather than to what Congress was actually doing. But there was one thing that Congress in the Confederation period did very, very well. And we call this generally the Western Lands Policy. So the Western Lands Policy were activities of the Confederation government, the Congress, that have a huge ultimate impact on America. So in a very positive way, I would suggest so. So this clearly is an indication of something that Congress did well. And so I want to kind of highlight this for you guys. Okay? So I got myself a new map, and that map that I was using, that it came to us from my National Geographic Atlas was, I don't think, necessarily very clear. I think the good thing about this map is that if nothing else, it's more colorful. Hopefully you guys can see that a little bit better. Let's get in there. Oh, we can't go too low, but we'll get a little bit in there, okay? All right, so in the aftermath of the American Revolution and the Peace of Paris, this is the United States of America right here. I've tried to outline it, and I did my little blue erasable marker, and I'm hoping it will erase. That'll be kind of done if it doesn't. But note that, United States, of course, is everything south of Canada, British held Canada. Then we see that's the Mississippi River, which is the western boundary, and then Spain controlled Florida and all the way across basically to Louisiana. So the United States did not have a southern coastal boundary at that particular time, okay? So this is the United States of America. Well, you have to kind of understand the impact of the Treaty of Paris. All of a sudden, the news comes of the provisions of the treaty. And that one critical one that just inspired so much in America was that the British were willing to cede to the Americans all lands east of the Mississippi River. All this land. Remember that the Americans are really only living here, kind of on the eastern seaboard, probably penetrating about 200 miles at the most. And all of a sudden, this new land is opened up. So one of the things that's going to happen here, and I think it's just really interesting, is that when this area becomes known to the Americans, one thing that the states do Any state that didn't have a western boundary, and we have to understand, of course, that it makes sense that they wouldn't have a western boundary. There was no reason to establish one. There were some states that did have western boundaries. So, for instance, Massachusetts did, Connecticut did, of course, Rhode Island did, surrounded. New Hampshire had a boundary. Vermont had a boundary also. No, Vermont's not a state, so let's not do that. Okay, but New Hampshire had a boundary. Anyway, some of them did, but many of these states just kind of go into the wilderness, and then it just sort of ends at that particular point. So the states that did not have a western boundary, in the second they heard about the Treaty of Paris, they decided that it was their right to extend their boundaries all the way to the Mississippi. So that meant that Georgia extended their boundary all the way out like this. Kabam! Georgia got big. Of course, North Carolina, again, it got extended all the way to the Mississippi River. Now, you can't really see it, but there's actually a distance between the northern border of Georgia and the southern border of North Carolina, and that was where South Carolina had like a little avenue. So they had this long, skinny extension of the state all the way to the Mississippi. We could call it the South Carolina Panhandle, because it looked like a big long panhandle. You guys know the panhandle concept, but it comes to us primarily from Oklahoma, where we can see that there is that kind of panhandle component to the whole thing. Now Virginia went crazy. They claimed everything. So they claim all the way up to what you and I would call Minnesota almost, okay? But Pennsylvania also wanted to claim an area out there, and New York had a claim, and Massachusetts. And so not only do you have these huge claims, but then you have what we call competing claims, where individual states are competing with each other over these lands to the west. And what it does, it creates a potential development of America. It's counterfactual, but I'm going to suggest, what could have happened. America could have been made up of what we could call mega-states. Those 13 original states could have decided to dominate America for the rest of history. And, the megastate concept is intriguing. So just imagine it continues. And so first Georgia expands to the Mississippi, but as more land is acquired, they're going to expand all the way to California, to the Pacific Ocean. Georgia is this huge megastate across the entire southern tier. And of course, North Carolina is a huge linear state going all the way to, I don't know what, Monterey Bay. And then I always like to think of that, continuation of the South Carolina Panhandle all the way to Bakersfield and out to Paso Robles or something like that, out to the coast there. Just crazy kind of situation configuration. I don't think the megastates would have survived. I don't think they would have stayed unified. They would have had so much land. They would have had potential for competition. I mean, think of a larger competition between megastates. Between the issues of slavery and freedom. If they had kept with the potential megastate development, I do believe that the nation would have fallen apart. I think things would have gone very differently, and I think for the nation much worse. So here's the first thing that Congress was able to do. They were able to get all of these individual states to cede their lands. So the states claimed these lands. They had no actual control over them, but the states are claiming these lands. And so the federal government is able to get them to cede those lands. So the western lands became not part of any state, but rather became part of the lands of the government of the United States, and really the lands of the people of the United States. Back off of this just a little bit. Whoops, wrong way. Okay. So the first thing that's going to happen during the Western Lands policy is that Congress takes over the Western lands, and I think that's critical. They can then begin to create a more rational and considered process by which the Western lands will begin to be developed. And we also avoid the phenomenon of the megastate, which I do not think would have been healthy for the United States of America. So, with these lands ceded, then Congress could begin to determine what's going to happen to them. Now, Congress always assumed that the lands would be open to the American people, and they would be a place of settlement. So the first thing that Congress decided to do, and this is very pragmatic, is they decided to survey the lands. And this would be done by something called the Land Ordinance of 1785. To be able to develop land, you have to survey it. Now, you and I don't pay that much attention necessarily as surveyors, but you see them, I've seen them, they're all over the place. They're checking out to see what's going to happen for the lands, or for the roads and for developments that are going to take place. And what they do is they determine the landscape. They kind of shape it in a way that you know where you are. Before you can actually buy some land, you kind of have to have it determined, where is this land, how do we describe this particular land? And so the Land Ordinance of 1785 was designed to help them to determine the landscape, of course, to divide the landscape, to allow individuals to begin to purchase the landscape. So it was this monumental program to try to survey the West. And I'm going to go to the map just a second. Push the map away, sorry about that. Well, what they did, they're just going to survey it. I don't know if you guys have a sense of how surveys work, but you always have to like start in a spot, and they started in a meaningful location. You can't really see it on this map very well, but it's kind of in the middle of the newly established western boundary of Pennsylvania. And where the Ohio River crossed that boundary, that became like, spot number one. We're going to go from that spot and we're going to determine everything else. What surveyors do, of course, is they take their I don't know what those things are called, those little telescope things that they have, of course, and they start to then just determine. And in many ways, they're like putting a little piece of wood here. Here's a marker. Maybe a little flag or something like that. But they began to survey the West. Now they did it by using just these lines. So they established with beginning east-west running lines. So and understand it's an abstraction, right? Though it could be demarked by like little stakes that you put in the ground or something like that. But they just began to put these lines in. And all you're doing, of course, is creating a foundation for determinations of things in the future. Now these lines were called, I can't remember what they're called. The lines were called baselines. Yay. So they created these things called baselines. Baselines are simply a point of departure where you can establish a base location, and then from that point on, of course, you can make all kinds of other determinations. All across the West, there will be these baselines. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but in San Bernardino, there's something called Baseline Avenue. And Baseline Avenue is the Southern California baseline. So from that line, all the other surveys will begin to radiate out from that, all right? So the baselines were east-west running lines. They're going along the lines of latitude, right? And those are parallels, of course, that are out there. So baselines at the beginning. The very first baseline started there where the Ohio crosses the Pennsylvania boundary. Now the baselines will be transected by north-south running lines, and these were called meridians. I have no idea if you guys are going to be able to see this very well, so I'm kind of closing on it just a little bit. Make sure we get a little bit of better view of the whole thing. So we got the baselines running east-west and the meridians running north-south. And then these lines could be used to create these large square areas. And the large square areas were called townships. And remember, all they're doing is, and I want you to know that the concept of township does not mean an actual town. It just meant that there was, am I running out of battery already? Doggone it, I think I am. Okay, I will pick this up as soon as I possibly can, but I will remember to myself that I am telling you about the Land Ordinance of 1785.